Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to Shut In, Shut Out, Shut Up, Ableism, Faith and Church. It's great to have you with us. I'm Fiona MacMillan. I'm a disability advocate, practitioner, speaker and writer. I chair the Disability Advisory Group at St Martin in the Fields, and I'm a trustee of Inclusive Church. Since 2012, I've been helping to shape an annual conference as a space for disabled and neurodivergent people to gather, to resource each other and the church. I'm delighted to be joined today by guest speakers Krysia Waldock and Noel. Let me begin with some housekeeping and how the session will work. Then I'll introduce the series and the speakers, and we'll get going into today's topic. If you'd like to, please do introduce yourselves in the chat. Perhaps say who you are and where you're coming from. This session will be recorded and posted on the Heart Edge Facebook page and YouTube channel. Do turn off your video if you don't wish to be seen on the recording. To ensure the quality of sound on the recording, please stay on mute unless you've been invited to speak. Some of us on the call today are sensitive to sound. I have Tourette's, and some sounds set off physical or verbal tics. Tics are involuntary movements and sounds, muscle spasms and words, which for me include swear words. I'll do my best to hold them in, which will probably make the session go a lot more smoothly, but it's not always possible. In the same way, you can't hold in a sneeze or a cough. And it's important that I come as I am. I hope you'll be comfortable to come as you are too. I hope you'll have seen the access information that we sent around with the Zoom details. We have BSL today in the plenary session and in one breakout group. Welcome to Janet Guest. If you'd like to pin Janet's screen so that you can watch her and follow with BSL, please do so. If you're not sure how to do that, please message Ben or Jonathan, who are our Heart Edge hosts today, and they'll be able to help you. We also have captions, auto captions. Click the bottom and choose show captions. You can follow the whole text or you can follow as we go along. If there's anything else that would help you to participate today, do message our Heart Edge hosts, Ben Sheridan and Jonathan Evans. And please do let Ben know if you'd like to be in the small group that uses BSL. So timings. In the first half of the conversation, from now until around 5:15, will be input. We'll hear today's guest speakers share their ideas around the topic. In the second half, we'll all have a chance to share experience and ideas. Firstly, around 5:15, we'll move into small breakout groups for around 10 minutes or so, then come back into the big group for questions and discussion. We'll end today with some thoughts and some information about future events. For the last 10 years, I've been working with teams of amazing colleagues to hold an annual conference on disability and church, in partnership with St Martin in the Fields and Inclusive Church. Last year, Heart Edge offered me a platform to share ideas with a wider audience, to create a space for more challenging conversations. I'm grateful for this opportunity to centre the voices, work and experience of disabled and neurodivergent Christians. Many of us are isolated by experience or geography. Here we gather to resource each other and the church. In this series, we're exploring ableism, faith and church. Ableism turns from looking at how systems work against disabled people and looks instead at what is being favoured. And just as racism discriminates in favour of white people, sexism in favour of men, so ableism privileges non-disabled people. We've put together a great resource list to accompany each session for those who'd like to dive a little deeper into the topics. These are a mix of articles, books, videos and web-based resources. We'll be dropping these in the chat for each session and then posting them on the Heart Edge website. The chat today will be saved and text sent out to everyone who requests it. Last week, we began by thinking about the context. You can catch up with that session on the Heart Edge YouTube channel. Today we'll be exploring ableism and culture, And next week, we'll be thinking a bit more about theology and practice, what ableism looks like in churches. Our speakers today bring the perspectives of critical autism studies and theology. They will outline something of the beliefs, behaviours, dynamics and attitudes which began and continue to make this an ableist society and culture. So let me introduce you to Krysia Waldock and Rachel Noel. Krysia Waldock is an autistic and disabled PhD candidate exploring the inclusion of autistic people within the context of belief systems. Her work focuses on social justice from the perspective of critical disability studies. She's currently researching the experiences of minority identities in churches, faith, and humanist communities. Rachel Noel is a late diagnosed autistic, ADHD, and disabled priest in the Diocese of Winchester. After a career in organisational strategy and change management in the cruise industry, Rachel was ordained in 2014. She has a particular interest in disability theology, mental health and trauma theology, and is the newest member of the Living Edge Conference planning team. Welcome, both of you. We're delighted to have you with us and looking forward to hearing what you're going to say. So perhaps I'm now going to invite you to each explore the culture of ableism, and perhaps we could start by introducing your work and ideas. Over to you, Krysia.
Thank you, Fiona. So I think culture is really important to consider when examining ableism, especially in groups and also in wider institutions. And it's often this culture which enables and further perpetuates ableist practices and other practices which actually don't foster this radical inclusion, which is informed by social justice, which many disabled and neurodivergent Christians are seeking and as many people need. A lot of my own personal interest and also research interest as well in churches and also society more broadly is actually to do with communities, stigma and culture, and how that coexists within groups and societies at large. As I'm a sociologist, I like to give a nice definition of culture. I'm hoping this is not too jargony. I've tried to pick one that's quite accessible for quite a few people. So I'm going to use O'Donnell's 1994 definition, and they almost see culture as a way of life in which there are generally accepted modes of conduct, so how we behave, and beliefs about behaviour and morality. And it's important to say that all groups of people and communities possess this idea of a culture. And from my background and also from my personal experience, I see ableism within churches and the church more broadly as part of an established culture. And this fits in with the definition of ableism, which both Anne and Naomi gave last week, with ableism as a social system. So in churches, the culture involves the theology, so what we think and what we believe, the traditions, so things we've done that have been passed down kind of generation to generation, and also the way we do things and the rationale behind them. So, for example, how we welcome people in, where we let people sit, how we worship, what we don't do, and our rationale for that, and also how we bring people into churches and what we class as inside group and people on the outside. And many communities, including churches and community groups, are actually not aware of their culture within them. And this may come, I think, in part from a lack of reflexivity. Now, reflexivity is quite a posh academic word, and I would almost define it as a lack of reflecting on what each person brings to the group in a very simple way. So this includes what each person brings to the group, who leads the groups, which ideas dominate, and where they come from. And certainly in very informal conversations with other autistic Christians, this does appear to be a recurring thing that I hear. And also, as we mentioned last week, everybody in a group or a community plays a role in maintaining that culture, and therefore also the things we do and believe, which may be ableist. For example, the fact that disability is caused by the fall, or perhaps not thinking what barriers are to access why people may or may not be present within groups. And I think it's really important to say in regards to being really reflexive, it is a difficult thing, irrelevant of who we are. And especially for those who are not used to understanding where we perhaps sit in society and also the privilege we might have. And this means we may be less accustomed to this and we may feel discomfort due to our privilege. And this lack of being reflective and lack of perceived need to reflect can actually impact on the group dynamics.
Brilliant, thanks Krysia, that's a really helpful introduction. It's always helpful to have a sociologist with us to explain our terms. So thanks for getting us started. So Rachel, perhaps you'd like to, I should first of all say, Rachel, thank you for stepping into the breach in this last week. Jane Woolmer-Girdlestone unfortunately was unable to be with us this week, but we hope she'll be able to speak in a later series. Rachel very kindly stepped up with just a week's notice, and I'm delighted you're able to join us today. Rachel, perhaps you'd like to say something about your ideas on this subject.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for inviting me today, and a huge thank you to you too for all your help with what I'm going to say. As with a week's notice, this is definitely a co-created piece of work between Fiona and I get the joy to actually share it with you. So thank you for your depth of insight, wisdom and resources that you've generously shared for this. Behind me, I have a large painting that I created that's of a large eye with a bright pink iris looking at it, surrounded by dark colours and black mottled squirrely stuff with words around it. And I'll say more about the painting later, but it's not there by accident. Alfred Schutz, quoted in Nancy Eisen's book, The Disabled Gods, says to us, "The place which my body occupies within the world, my actual here, is the starting point from which I take my bearings in space. It is, so to speak, the center zero in my system of coordinates." Except for many of us living with a variety of conditions, we've learned that we can't take our bodies for granted. We may never have been able to take our bodies for granted. Our ground zero, our center, we may well have learned not to trust our bodies, been told that our bodies are wrong, been pressured to conform, to try and fit, to hide, to mask. In our churches, our theology of being often starts with our theology of creation, and often we are taught creation out of nothing. And into that nothingness, we see God pouring in, creating all sorts of wonderful things, and God saw that it was good. We get the stories of Adam and Eve in our stories, and in artworks, these are almost always portrayed as able-bodied, idealized, perfect beings. In Genesis 1, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And in Genesis 2, it tells us Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. These first people were at home with each other and with God, with no shame. And then we tend to get told the story in a simplistic way, Eve and Adam, the apple, the fall. And we're told that this is where pain comes in for the woman. Pain becomes associated with the theology of the fall. And there enters the language of brokenness and shame. Judith Russell writes more about this in her book, it's one of the ones here, Forbidden Fruit and Fig Leaves, saying, if shame is intimately linked with our sense of how others see us, then it's even more intimately linked with a fear of exposure. For many of us, our greatest fear is that if our real naked self is seen, then we might be rejected. Paintings of creation don't seem to show pain or differently shaped bodies or different ways of being. Adam and Eve are a bit like the original Ken and Barbie dolls or the photoshopped images in magazines. Disability theology as a liberation theology challenges these very starting points. Shane Clifton points out that if creation is good, as Genesis 1 claims, then disability is good. The same life-giving processes also generate disability. The paradox of life is that potency and vulnerability go together. And because this is so far from being a consequence of sin, disability is a good, a symbol of potent, creative beauty, a testimony to the generativity and limits of nature. Just as God is wholly other, the divine image is not captured in the ideal of a singular, manly, reasoned perfection, but in the vulnerable, untamed, chaotic, potent limits of disabled bodies. Ableism in our churches becomes both implicit and explicit in our language, in our art, in our liturgy, in the hymns that we sing, embedding the deep belief that able is superior and reinforcing the prejudice that disabled people require fixing, that they're broken, that we're broken. And entwining ableism in our liturgy creates and reinforces a sense of shame. June Boyce-Tillman talks about the language of liturgy and says, we need to work hard at a change of attitudes. It may involve learning new skills and expanding the meaning of concepts, often unlearning what was formerly believed to be true. This is costly for our churches. It might mean new songs, new books, challenging the use of treasured hymns. This isn't something that can be tackled with lip service. Are we willing, individually and collectively, to let this sink in? Back to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Rachel. That's just great to lead us from the concepts and begin to think about how we are living it out in our beliefs and our faith and in our worship and in our life together as church. But perhaps beginning with the wider community, let's start to think a little bit about culture and the wider world. Krysia, how does ableism manifest in culture in the wider world?
Many cultures more broadly, as we said last week, have historically valued able-bodied bodies and neurotypical brains over disabled bodies and neurodivergent brains, as Rachel has just said, but also Anne and Naomi also said last week. And I think this in turn has led to who we value be influenced by society we live in and the groups we attend. And for me, one quote that really sums this up is, no man is an island, by John Donne. And as a disabled and neurodivergent person, I see this play out daily. And society itself is very nebulous, so forever changing and evolving and very dynamic in nature. So by default, I would also see culture as technically always evolving and changing as well, as we're so society is, if it kind of reflects culture. And also it's important to say at this point that culture isn't always geographically located, although sometimes it is. There is an increasing dialogue and consensus on one particular culture called Autistic Culture. And this is the shared way of life and modes of conduct and communication. And this can be how we speak to each other, how we communicate, how understanding of how our bodies and brains work. And certainly Martin Decker and Imogen Sinclair have both written some fantastic accessible works about autistic culture, and a few of them are in the resources that will either be coming up in the chat or will be on the Heart Edge website. And I think communication is a key part of autistic culture, with differences for neurotypical people in understanding autistic communication and difficulties for autistic people also understanding neurotypical communication. And this is known as the double empathy problem. So for example, autistic people may put more focus on the actual words that they use rather than the context and the agenda behind them, whereas people who are not autistic may actually be giving off a slightly different message, which leads, basically using my hand in audio describe, two hands basically passing each other in the wind rather than meeting in the middle. And this different communication outlook on the world that autistic have is often not understood in wider society. And it's really important also that trauma and power are important in understanding our lived experiences and how we many disabled and neurodivergent people may respond to things. Especially we have been marginalised, as many of us can actually attest to. And where many of us have been marginalised, trauma and power imbalances have often shaped our lived experience, either through power domination, so our voice being spoken over, enforced normalisation, for example, ABA practices, or psycho-emotional disablement. And this term is quite a complicated term. I find it quite jargony personally, but to simplify this term, it's basically restricting who we can be. And it's a term that was originally coined by Carol Thomas in 1999. And the lack of knowledge or willingness to know about enforced normalization and psycho-emotional disablement kind of links back to this lack of reflecting on who we are and what we bring to a culture and whose ideas we prioritize and value over other people's. And also this can restrict what disabled and neurodivergent people can do and how we can be.
Brilliant, thanks Krysia. I think for many people the idea of there being an autistic culture will be a new one, but you very helpfully put a lot of resources into the chat with a wonderful range from the academic, for those who are interested in textbooks and articles, to the straightforward online articles and shorter pieces. So thank you very much for that. Rachel, as a theologian, how do you think ableism is present in the language, in the culture of language and beliefs, in the wider context, in the wider world?
I think this internalized ableism we talked about last week, I think it runs really deep in our society generally, and possibly even deeper in our churches because of the connections we've made with regards to purity, of goodness, of perfection. And one of the challenges I think in the culture that's difficult is that often ableism is disguised within the best of intentions. June Boyce Tillman describes how disabled people came to be viewed as worthy poor, as opposed to work-shy unworthy poor, and given poor relief, a place in the workhouse or money from public funds. Disabled people became more and more dependent on the medical profession too for cures, treatments and benefits, and were shut away. Separate special schools and day centres were set up that denied disabled and non-disabled people the day-to-day experience of living and growing up together. This was done out of good intentions. Christian institutions set them up, typically churches supporting them, seeking to do good. Non-disabled people making decisions, seeking to help, to fix, accidentally othering disabled people. Disabled people often became seen only as the recipients of care, people to be done to, the vulnerable, the weak, expected to lead lives as passive victims, often expected to be grateful for that. In the Bible, in Revelations 21, we see God wipe away all tears, has led to an idea of a disability-free afterlife, because disability is unworthy and linked with sin, as I hinted earlier. The idea of disability needing to be healed is another source for the marginalisation of disabled people in this world. But Christ is resurrected with wounds. In his book, The Bible, Disability in the Church, biblical scholar Amos Young writes, as Christ's body is an earthly image of the divine, then vulnerability is central to the heavenly order. Disabled people are reflections of God's own image, as well as his solidarity with the oppressed. But the value structures that devalue disability will be eliminated, and it is the elimination of these value structures, not the disabilities they stigmatise, that will bring about the end of tears. When we read in Paul's letter, he describes a theology of weakness, in which qualities that are normally devalued, such as foolishness, frailty, fragility, and vulnerability, are marks of how God empowers his people. 2 Corinthians, Paul tells us, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. And in Acts, we're told, pour out my spirit upon all flesh, all people, not just some, all flesh, different voices, different bodies. God's spirit blows through all of us. Back to you, Fiona.
Thanks, Rachel and Krysia. You're beginning to help us to think about both society and the theologies, the beliefs which lead to the behaviours, and the culture that start to shape the culture and how we behave with one another, these things which create barriers, assumptions, and attitudes. So, Krysia, you've given us a very helpful idea of the wider context. What about the culture of church?
I think in regards to church, the first important thing to note is that church communities are impacted by how professionals in the secular, medical and academic communities define disability. And that's a great quote by Brett Webb Mitchell in their 1994 book. And even though this quote is from 1994, it is still actually relevant today and also relevant to neurodivergence. But one thing that struck me when I was reading this was, where are the disabled and neurodivergent voices in regards to this quote? So obviously you've got secular, medical and academic communities, but what about those of us that aren't involved in either of those groups or have been shut out of those groups? And certainly 3 things I think need to be considered are a lack of understanding and knowledge of autistic culture. And this can be from both this is from my own personal experience, but also engaging with churches in past research projects, and also the lack of understanding of our own culture, as I mentioned in the wider context and also at the beginning, but also as Anne and Naomi fantastically covered with us last week. And these have accumulated along with the theologies of disability, which Rachel has touched on, and especially those which are not liberatory in nature, to a culture where ableism is not condemned, or at least not openly condemned. And certainly in regards to my own research, I did a paper with my colleague, Professor Rachel Forrester-Jones, who's now at the University of Bath, and we looked at attitudes towards autism in 5 churches. It was a very small exploratory study, but what we did find was that ableism informed how people thought about and enacted and behaved towards autistic people in a church environment, and also that different churches had different cultures. So there isn't one set church culture, although there's an institutional church kind of culture that feeds in. Each different group understood and played with things a little bit differently. And these differences in culture could be due to different makeup of congregations in regards to age, lived experiences, but also theologies and understanding and experience of disabled and neurodivergent people as well. And it's these differences in culture which are key to note in regards to any growth or change, and that one size fits all doesn't really work in regard to churches, which is showing how important it is to engage with where we sit and how we position ourselves. And I think this also links to the thought of all spaces being inclusive, but disabled and neurodivergent people being unable to get in, as Naomi mentioned last week. And often from my own experience and from research, it's theology which is often the sticking point, as beliefs are much harder to change than knowledge is, and theology is a part of a belief system. And is also key in how we behave and the attitudes we hold. And so I almost see being really reflective of in yourself as key to challenging ableism, especially within a church context.
Brilliant, thank you, Krysia. Challenging as always, but also it's not just about the direct behaviours, but a lot of it comes from the theologies. So Rachel, you're a professional. How does ableism manifest in the culture of church?
I think it might be helpful for me to share my personal story, something of my personal story, to help us to try and start this conversation of quite how deeply rooted ableism can be and its impact on us. I grew up diagnosed with severe asthma. So for me, that was hospitals, nebulizer at home, medications, allergies, restrictions. At church, I was on the prayer list every week. Prayers for healing, more prayers. I wasn't good enough, broken. Did I need to repent? More prayers. Mid-teens, it turns out I was allergic to the floor polish at the Baptist church, one of many allergies. Prayers for me to be healed. But I could no longer enter the building and breathe because of a choice of floor polish. It was a large vat of floor polish, money and power, ableism, It's how I started going to an Anglican church. I am now an Anglican vicar, so there's good things come out of this. But they kept praying for me, or pray. Deep-rooted ableism in prayers can be used to wield power, to abuse and to reinforce shame. Years later, my spiritual director challenged me to sit with the words, "I can be well." But I knew I was unwell. I'd been prayed for at church every week since I was tiny. I had absorbed this ableism. I knew that I was deficient. It took me months, incredulous. I can be well? I can be well? I can be well? I can be well. I am well. To be willing to look at myself and to notice wellness with me, within my body, my breath, my lack, my brokenness, there was wellness in me. It took me another 20 years to be able to smile at myself in the mirror and really know that God saw that in me. Nancy Iceland describes, "Much of my life I waited for a mighty revelation of God. I did experience an epiphany, but it bore little resemblance to the God I was expecting or the God of my dreams. My return to intimacy with God began at a rehabilitation hospital for persons with spinal cord injuries." This is Nancy's story, not mine. "One afternoon, after a long and frustrating day, I shared with the group my own doubts about God's care for me. I asked them how they would know if God was with them and understood their experience. After a long silence, a young African-American man said, 'If God was in a sip puff, maybe he would understand.' I was overwhelmed by this image. God in a sip puff wheelchair, the kind used by many quadriplegics that enables them to maneuver the chair by blowing and sucking on a straw-like device. Not an omnipotent, self-sufficient God, but neither a pitiable, suffering servant. This was an image of God as a survivor, as one of those whom society would label not feasible, unemployable, with questionable quality of life." How many times have we all had those things? Several weeks later, I was reading in Luke's Gospel about an appearance of the resurrected Jesus. The focus of this passage is really on his followers who are alone and depressed. Jesus says to them, "Why are you frightened, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see." This wasn't exactly God in a sip puff, but here was the resurrected Christ making good on the promise that God would be with us, embodied as we are, disabled and divine. In this passage, I recognized a part of my hidden history as a Christian. Nancy goes on to say that the foundation of Christian theology is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Yet seldom is the resurrected Christ recognized as a deity whose hands, whose feet, whose side bear the marks of profound physical impairment. Back to you, Fiona.
Thanks, Rachel. Nancy Iceland, The Disabled God, is a seminal work of disability theology as a liberation theology, but was written, I think, almost 20 years ago. But before we move into small groups to think about things together, I think perhaps let's look for signs of hope. Krysia, what's working well or growing for good that you're aware of?
For me, one of the things that I see almost as growing for good is the increasing discourse from autistic and neurodivergent people, including academic discourse from autistic, neurodivergent and disabled people, including on this topic of religion, churches and religious studies, as often academic works are seen as coming from a place of power. And there are other recent papers from other neurodivergent authors that are worth reading, notably Naomi Jacobs' thesis and the book they're writing, is fantastic, and I'd highly recommend that. And I also read another fantastic research article by Erin Burnett on the pastoral care of autistic adults in churches, which is also a really good read. I think it's also important to state, although I'm saying that academic discourse is good, as a glimmer of hope, the level of ableism within academia on a systemic level is quite high. It's ridiculously high. And this effectively shows what we're up against in terms of who is listened to and who is allowed to participate. Another hopeful thing I find is the on-the-ground connections that exist between disabled and neurodivergent people, particularly online. And it would be a lie to say that we all get on, but it's certainly true that we gather in places and find a sense of belonging among each other, probably informed by our shared lived experiences and the shared kinship we have. And online and social media gives us choice and agency that we have as humans, and access to liberation theologies much more easily than prior through communities of practice. And these communities of practice which are disabled led are really, really powerful, I think. And I know many of us are frustrated by a speed of change, but the fact that there is change for me, which is disabled and neurodivergent led, is really hopeful, and I'm hopeful that things will speed up as well.
Thanks, Krysia. It's helpful to know there is hope, particularly in the world of academia. Rachel, are there signs of hope in the culture of church?
I think so, and I think, like Krysia talks about the connections, for me, gatherings like the one we're in now, emerging conversations that challenge the dominant narratives, give huge signs of hope. And Fiona, I'm so grateful for you, for your personal courage, persistence and perseverance and hard work in making these events happen, because without you, we wouldn't be here to talk together and to know that there were other people thinking the same things we do. Through things like this, we educate each other, we support each other, and you through what you do and through how you help us and we resource each other, challenges the deep language that is throughout so much of church culture. And this week you've helped to resource me to make this come together. I'm hopeful, really hopeful, that by connecting and resourcing each other, of even finding each other, that we get bolder in understanding ourselves. Many of us are used to hiding. And through our conversations, we get used to actually noticing the ableism in ourselves too, that we've internalized, and the culture that we are in. I'm going to end with a couple of images that may illustrate something of what we've been saying. I'm about to switch my video to be an image now. There we go. This is an image of Michelangelo's painting with a naked Adam in the world on the left of the painting, with a white background, and then there's a human-shaped clothed God on the top right, surrounded by creatures in the heavens, and God is reaching his finger out and just touching Adam, who's reaching his finger back to God. This painting is a clearly placed painting, everything in its exact place, beautiful bodies, everything in place. I haven't got time to give you a full intro today, but I absolutely love Catherine Keller's theology in her book, Face of the Deep, which particularly notices the early verses of the book of Genesis and speaks of a theology of creation out of the deep, out of the chaos, rather than out of nothing. I'm going to switch my image now to be a video as I speak, playing with Keller's ideas. This is a video of the making of the painting that's visible behind me. The video shows me with a large canvas on which I've already painted a large eye with a pink iris, and then I'm pouring acrylic paints out of cups. This acrylic pouring, they're tipped out, squished together, and then I tip the canvas around and move the paints around to create the colour, the mess and the muddle and the chaos that you see of colours, and the colours mixed together. This painting making an eye out of chaos. Oh, and I'll just put an image, a better image on screen you can see. This image, this painting is an eye that is a representation of God's eye gazing on me and on you. It took me until this year to be able to sit with an image of God's eye gazing on me. Ableism ran so deep within me, reinforced by so much of the culture around me, as I sat eventually letting God's eye gaze on me, to see me without shame, made as I am. and I wrote on my painting a rewriting of Genesis 1 with a bit of Psalm, and I'm going to read what the words are to you now. In the beginning, silence, depth, chaos, vibrations becoming breath. Let there be differences. Deep calls to deep. Sink deep and feel that I am God. Let there be creativity and compassion, diversity and connection, spirituality, joy and paradox. God saw it was good. My hope is that we are willing to let God look at us and look at each other and allow ourselves to believe and accept that God sees that we are good. Thank you.
Amen. Amen, amen. Thank you, Rachel.
Oh yes, I'm a vicar.
Thank you, Rachel. So thank you both for a fascinating and challenging and informative insight into how ableism is woven into our beliefs and behaviours, churches and communities, and for those signs of hope. We're now going to move into small groups for about 10 minutes. These are groups of 3 or 4, and it's a loosely structured space, a chance to say hello, to share experience and ideas. I firmly believe that each of us have something worth sharing. Each of us bring ideas and experience, and they're all equally important. And that's why we divide this time together into time to listen and time to speak. So it's a loosely structured space to say hello and perhaps consider what's resonated with you from this conversation, what's echoed your own experience, or what shocked or surprised you, what's resonated with you, what's echoes, or what shocked or surprised you. And perhaps thinking about the challenge, what call do you hear? What challenge will you pick up? What change might you make? Ben's going to pop us into small groups. The people using BSL should all be in the same group. If you're in the wrong group, then please just leave the group and come back to the middle. And we'll see you back here just before 12:30, I think, 25 past. I'm going to begin drawing things to a close now by inviting Krysia and Rachel to share 1 or 2 ideas they'd like us to take away. Then I'm going to signpost to the future and then share with you a few of my own thoughts around today's conversation. Krysia, perhaps we could start with you.
Thanks, Fiona. I guess for my final thought, I'd go back to the quote from John Donne that I gave at the beginning. So no man is an island. And our value in ourselves is inherent and God-given rather than culturally situated. And I don't think the church has really quite cottoned on to that yet. Perceived value is almost culturally situated, but I guess as Rachel said just now, we need to kind of know that we're valued as we are, and we need to move from a narrative of apparent value to valuing people as they come, and being really reflective and examining your own internalized ableism is almost part of a journey and key to this. And I guess that's the final thought I'd like people to take away.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm getting quite a few messages, direct messages in the chat. My apologies, I find it really hard. I've got a particular type of brain damage and I find it really hard to keep up with them. But if there are people who wanted to speak to me personally or directly or share something, if you message the Heart Edge team, and they'll be very happy to pass on my contact details or to forward your message, or contact me on Twitter, that would be great. Rachel, be lovely to hear from you. What final thoughts would you have for people today?
I'd echo those that talked about the challenge around neurodiversity and church institutions and processes, and I think we've got a huge way to go on that, and we're only just at the start of that journey. I think for me, I'd echo into what I said earlier about good intentions are not enough, and actually they can be dangerous and abusive, and it's a hard tension to walk in. I guess I want to probably come back to Shane Clifton's words actually and let them sink in again, of if creation is good, then disability is good, and that those same life-giving processes also generate disability. And that paradox of life is that potency and vulnerability go together. And are we willing to allow ourselves to keep letting God look at us and each other? And for me, that's my painting. That's what that is. And there's a link, I think, if you want to have your own copy of that, but I share it on Facebook and Twitter, so feel free to find it on there too, and use it if it's helpful to you. But how do we resource each other in that, to encourage each other in this, that we're not imagining it. God is good, and God made us good, and God sees us as good.
Thanks, Rachel. Thank you so much, Krysia and Rachel, for being with us today and for sharing some of your experience, research and ideas from what sounds like the sharp end of the cutting edge. It's been brilliant to have you with us. And Rachel, thank you again for kindly stepping in at short notice as Jane was unable to join us today. We hope to hear from her in a future series. Thanks to all of you for being here today. None of us have all the answers, which is why these conversations can be so helpful, especially at a time when people are more divided than ever. I hope today has informed or encouraged you. If you'd like to dive deeper, the resources will also be available on the Heart Edge website. This series is one among many gifts in the Heart Edge Online Festival of Theology, Living God's Future Now. Ben's listed some in the chat. Do have a look at the Heart Edge YouTube channel or Facebook page to catch up with other cutting edge conversations. If you like what Heart Edge are doing and would like to be part of church renewal, do join Heart Edge or sign up for the mailer. This is the second of 3 conversations in this series on ableism, faith and church. Next week, we'll be exploring practice, picking up from today's discussion of beliefs and behaviours to look at the physical and sensory ways that make ableism so much a part of church. My guests next week will be Reverend Dr. Hannah Lewis and Dr. Rachel Holdforth. Hannah Lewis is a deaf BSL using priest, currently working in Liverpool Diocese as pioneer minister with the deaf community and supporting disability access for parishes. Hannah is also a freelance deaf liberation theologian and researches, writes and presents on that topic whenever the chance arises. Rachel Holdforth is a disability advocate, chaplain, spiritual director and printmaker. Rachel is disability advisor for her area within the Third Order of the Society of St. Francis. She's working on a series of prints representing disabled perspectives within Christianity. When behaviours and beliefs are oppressive, it's hard to know where to begin. But over the last 10 years of these conferences, it's becoming clear that something is changing. Disabled and neurodivergent people live with the knowledge of our own vulnerability. We feel our weakness, and that is precisely where God works. The Holy Spirit whispers in many ears, and something has already begun. Behold, I am creating a new thing. Do you not perceive it? There are hopeful signs in small places, so let me end by sharing a few small signs of hope from around the world. John Hull was part of our first conference back in 2012 and came back in 2014 as a keynote speaker, sharing the theology that became the book Disability, the Inclusive Church Resource. In it, he writes that disability theology is itself a demand for justice. It's a call for the removal of obstacles that prevent people from obtaining equality. We must first denounce, he says, before we announce. Becoming aware of the biases and discriminatory attitudes that have historically been justified as being biblical, but are rooted in interpretation. And just this week, I've started reading a new book by Dr. Lamar Hardwick, a Black autistic pastor in the US, Disability and the Church, a Vision for Diversity and Inclusion. In it, he writes, The very image of what Nancy Iceland would call the disabled God is the very image that anchors a bright vision for the future of the church. It is the worship of God in the community of faith that invites the world to enter a relationship with God, God who stands both mortally wounded and mighty and worthy at the same time, without contradiction or condemnation. And Australian Pentecostal theologian Shane Clifton, whose work Rachel drew upon today, says that disabled Christians are called to a subversive obedience. A subversive obedience. That is a faith which is rooted in God and a desire for the kingdom, but does not settle for the status quo. We're called to a faith which challenges ableist interpretation of the Bible and the disabling culture of church. I hope today has called you to a subversive obedience, has encouraged you to notice and to name ableism in our culture, and has equipped you to question beliefs and behaviours in our churches and communities. Thank you again to Krysia and to Rachel, and to all of you for being part of this conversation today. I hope to see you next week.
I want to jump in and say thank you to Fiona for making it happen, because wow, and your insight and vision to create this space. Thank you.
I agree.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everybody.